Hello there, my Twilight souls. Tonight, we journey into the heart of vampire civilization, to the ancient ones who shaped immortal lore through violence and vision, who built their throne on centuries of blood and called it justice. The Volturi are the beautiful terror at the center of our story. The three brothers who claimed eternity and made it bow, who transformed chaos into order through methods that make even monsters hesitate. I honestly hate doing this, but I gotta ask. If you're enjoying the videos, please consider subscribing. I'm trying to hit 1,000 subscribers before Christmas. That would seriously be the best Christmas present ever. And it keeps me going to make these Twilight stories for you. Alright, now it's time. Let the weight of millennia carry you gently into rest. The world before the Volturi was drowning in its own supernatural chaos. The early centuries of vampire existence marked by violence so constant and so visible that humanity teetered perpetually on the edge of discovering the predators living among them and developing the organizational capacity to fight back with numbers and fire and daylight tactics that would have exterminated the vampire species entirely. Vampire covens in those ancient times, before Greece reached its classical period and before Rome, was anything more than a collection of huts on 7 hills, made no attempt to hide their nature or their feeding or their wars with each other over territory and humans and pride and resources that immortals claimed as their right to control. They built structures that humans recognized as supernatural strongholds, ruling over regions with the kind of open tyranny that created legends and folklore and persistent cultural memory that would take millennia to fade into the realm of dismissed superstition rather than accepted dangerous reality. The vampires of that era hunted in daylight when cloud cover permitted, their skins glittering betrayal in direct sunlight, being the only physical limitation on their visibility and their brazen disregard for secrecy that would seem insane to later generations who understood the absolute necessity of hiding among the human population rather than lording over it like the gods they sometimes believed themselves to be in their youth and their arrogance. They fought territorial wars that left evidence even human witnesses could not explain away. Battles that decimated villages caught in the crossfire between covens, struggling for dominance over feeding grounds and tribute systems where humans were kept as livestock in arrangements that resembled the worst of human slavery, but implemented by creatures who could not be overthrown by any rebellion. The mortals attempted with their pathetically fragile weapons and their even more fragile bodies. Children grew up knowing that monsters were real, that certain areas could not be entered after dark or sometimes even during the day. That disappearances were not mystery but predictable consequence of living near the territories where the cold ones claimed dominion and demanded sacrifice. Aro was born into this chaos in a time that predates reliable historical record, his human life occurring somewhere in the Mediterranean region during the centuries when Greece was emerging from its dark age and beginning the cultural flowering that would define Western civilization for thousands of years to come. Though his exact origins remain unclear, even to those who know him now, because he rarely speaks of his human existence, and because the memories from that time are distant enough that even vampire recall cannot maintain perfect clarity across 3,000 years of accumulated experience. He was transformed in his 20s or 30s. The specific circumstances of his turning lost time, or perhaps deliberately obscured, his maker unknown or dead or simply irrelevant to the story that Aro became, once he discovered that his transformation had granted him a gift that transcended the normal abilities shared by all vampires, and that would become the foundation of everything he would build across the subsequent millennia. The gift revealed itself gradually, as most gifts do. Aro's early experiences with his enhanced ability, probably seeming like intuition or lucky guessing, before he recognized the pattern and understood that his talent was genuine telepathy, but limited by the requirement of physical contact. His ability to read every thought a person had ever had by simply touching their skin, making him effectively omniscient in any interaction, where he could engineer a handshake or a brush of fingers, or a moment of contact that gave him complete access to someone's mind and memories and secrets. The implications were staggering once he understood what he could do. The tactical advantages of knowing exactly what everyone around him was thinking and planning and fearing, making it nearly impossible for anyone to deceive him or surprise him or betray him without his foreknowledge giving him opportunity to prevent or punish the offense before it could fully materialize into action against him. But the gift was also isolating in ways that Aro probably did not anticipate in those early decades. The complete knowledge of everyone's thoughts, creating barrier between himself and anything resembling genuine connection or surprise, or the pleasant uncertainty that makes relationships meaningful for those who cannot see into the souls of everyone they encounter. His interactions with other vampires and with humans reduced to performances where he pretended not to know things he absolutely knew the moment skin touched skin, and truth became unavoidable and total. He was alone in his omniscience, brilliant and powerful, and completely incapable of being surprised by anyone once he had touched them and absorbed their entire mental history into his own consciousness that grew more crowded with other people's memories and other people's thoughts. With every hand he shook, and every vampire he encountered, and every meal he consumed that gave him brief access to human minds in their final terrified moments. His meeting with Marcus happened during Aro's travels through the ancient world, perhaps in Greece, or perhaps further east, where vampire covens were consolidating power, and where the danger of discovery was becoming acute enough that even the most arrogant immortals were beginning to recognize that something had to change, or the species would face organized human resistance that might actually succeed in driving them to extinction through sheer numbers and desperate innovation born of existential threat. Marcus was old even then, transformed decades or perhaps centuries before Aro. His gift of perceiving relationships between people manifesting as visible lines of connection that only he could see. The bonds between individuals appearing to his unique sight as cords of varying thickness and color and strength. that revealed love and loyalty and hatred and alliance and every shade of human and vampire connection with perfect clarity, that made him naturally philosophical about the nature of bonds and the ways that relationships shape behavior and loyalty and betrayal. They recognized in each other the rarity of significant gifts beyond the standard vampire abilities, their complementary talents suggesting possibilities that neither had considered before their meeting created opportunity for collaboration and shared vision about what vampires could become if properly organized and properly governed by those with the wisdom and the power to enforce laws that would protect the species from its own self-destructive visibility. Marcus brought philosophical perspective and understanding of how relationships could be leveraged or broken, his gift making him naturally suited to understanding social dynamics and political structures in ways that Aro's telepathy could not quite capture despite giving him access to individual thoughts. The difference between knowing what everyone thinks and understanding how groups function together, becoming the foundation of their partnership and their eventual success at building lasting vampire civilization. Caius joined them later, his addition to what would become the ruling triumvirate, born from different circumstances and different needs. His transformation occurring under traumatic conditions that left him with permanent scars that even vampire healing could not erase, and with rage that thousands of years have done nothing to diminish or moderate into something resembling forgiveness or peace. The details of his human death and vampire rebirth remain unclear to outsiders, but the evidence suggests an encounter with the children of the moon, true werewolves capable of matching vampire strength during their lunar transformations, that left Caius broken and scarred and filled with hatred that would later fuel centuries of genocidal warfare against the werewolf species that he would pursue with single-minded vengeance, long after any strategic justification for the extermination campaign had ceased to matter to anyone except Caius himself and his need to punish the creatures who had made him into a scarred monster among beautiful monsters. He brought to the partnership something that Aro's brilliance and Marcus's wisdom lacked, a capacity for violence and intimidation, and the kind of theatrical cruelty that makes examples memorable and makes enemies hesitate before challenging authority backed by someone willing to inflict suffering far beyond what is strategically necessary. His rage channeled into service of their shared vision, but never fully controlled or controllable by even Aro's manipulation or Marcus's understanding of bonds. Caius was the enforcer, the visible threat, the promise of what would happen to those who violated the laws that the three of them would establish once they consolidated enough power to make their authority something that other covens would respect out of fear, if not out of agreement with the philosophical justifications that Aro preferred to articulate when given opportunity to explain their vision for vampire civilization. The three of them together formed something unprecedented in vampire history, a leadership structure that combined Aro's knowledge through his gift of reading minds, Marcus's understanding of relationships and loyalty through his ability to see bonds, and Caius's willingness to enforce their decisions with whatever violence proved necessary, regardless of how excessive or cruel the punishment might seem to those with more moderate temperaments or more conventional morality. They discussed endlessly in those early years what vampires were and what vampires could become. Their philosophical debates about the nature of their existence and their relationship to humanity and their responsibilities to their own kind, creating the intellectual framework that would eventually become codified law enforced by their growing power and their increasing reputation as vampires, who could not be challenged or deceived or betrayed without facing consequences that made death seem merciful by comparison. The fundamental problem they identified was exposure, the risk that vampire visibility posed not just to individual covens, but to the entire species whose survival depended on humanity remaining ignorant, or at least uncertain, about the existence of immortal predators living among them and feeding on them with regularity that would provoke extermination efforts if the truth became undeniable and widespread. They recognized that vampires could not continue operating openly, that the territorial wars and the human cattle systems and the visible supernatural strongholds were actively creating conditions where humanity would eventually organize effective resistance. That secrecy was not optional preference, but existential necessity for a species that was individually superior to humans, but vastly outnumbered by prey, that could become dangerous if properly motivated and properly organized against the common enemy. Their solution was governance, the establishment of laws that would be enforced by vampires powerful enough to punish violators and visible enough that their authority could not be ignored or dismissed by covens accustomed to operating independently without regard for collective security or species survival. They would become the authority that other vampires feared more than they feared human discovery, the threat that made secrecy seem preferable to the alternative of facing the Volturi's judgment and the Volturi's punishment for crimes against the unwritten law that they would write and enforce with absolute ruthlessness disguised as justice. Volterra was chosen as their seat of power for strategic reasons that combined military defensibility with symbolic significance. The ancient Etruscan city in Tuscany, offering easily controlled access through limited entry points and offering historical gravitas that suggested permanence and legitimacy to their claim of authority over vampire civilization. The city was old even when they claimed it, its walls and its architecture speaking to human ambitions of creating something lasting that would survive generations. Their appropriation of Volterra as vampire capital, representing their own ambition to create immortal institutions that would govern their immortal species for as long as vampires existed anywhere in the world. They established themselves in the heart of the city, where they could control the human population and where they could receive visitors who came seeking their judgment or their favor or their mercy that was rarely granted, without extracting some price or some promise that served the Volturi's interests and strengthened their grip on vampire civilization. The early recruitment of Chelsea represented Aro's strategic genius in recognizing how power is built and maintained across centuries and millennia. Her gift of manipulating emotional bonds between people, making her arguably the most important member of the guard that they would assemble around themselves as both protection and projection of their authority. Chelsea could sever loyalties and create attachments through her gift's influence on the supernatural bonds that Marcus could see, but that others experienced as genuine emotion and genuine devotion. Her ability to make people feel loyalty to the Volturi or feel indifference toward former allies, making her the invisible mechanism through which their power became self-reinforcing and nearly impossible to challenge from within their own organization. every guard member who joined them was bound by Chelsea's gift, ensuring that betrayal became not just dangerous, but psychologically impossible. That desertion would require overcoming artificial emotional attachments that felt completely real to those experiencing them. That the Volturi's guard would remain loyal, not just through fear or through respect, but through Chelsea's continuous manipulation of the bonds that kept them tied to Aro and Marcus and Caius, with devotion that seemed freely given, but that was carefully cultivated and constantly maintained. They built their guard slowly and carefully over the subsequent centuries, each edition chosen for specific gifts or specific abilities that would strengthen their capacity to enforce their will across the vampire world, and to defend themselves against challenges from covens that might resent their authority, or might seek to overthrow them and claim power for themselves. The recruitment process became almost ritualistic. Aro's reading of potential members' minds, giving him complete knowledge of their abilities and their loyalties and their potential uses. Marcus's sight, showing whether existing bonds would interfere with their service to the Volturi. Chelsea's gift, ensuring that once someone joined, they could not easily leave or betray the organization without her releasing the artificial bonds she had created or strengthened to tie them to their masters. The guard grew to include dozens of vampires with various talents ranging from the combat skills that Felix would later represent to the tracking abilities that Dimitri would perfect to the more exotic gifts like Jane and Alex's devastating mental attacks that would not join them until much later, but that would become synonymous with Volturi power in the minds of vampires who feared their judgment. Their early enforcement actions were calculated demonstrations of their seriousness and their capacity for violence. The Volturi traveling to confront covens that operated too openly, or that created too many vampires without proper control, or that drew human attention through their feeding patterns or their visibility or their wars with neighboring vampire groups. They did not ask permission or wait for invitation. Their arrival in the territory constituting judgment that had already been passed and that would be executed regardless of pleas or explanations or promises to reform behaviors that had already violated the fundamental law. They killed efficiently and thoroughly, eliminating not just the guilty parties, but often their entire covens to send clear message that association with lawbreakers carried its own consequences, and that the Volturi's justice was absolute and non-negotiable. Once they had decided that violations warranted their personal attention and their personal intervention. The fundamental law they established was elegant in its simplicity and devastating in its implications. Vampires must remain secret from the human world. Exposure of the vampire species to widespread human awareness constituted the ultimate crime punishable by immediate execution without possibility of appeal or mercy. And any action that risked exposure even without achieving it could still warrant destruction if the Volturi judged the risk sufficiently serious. This single law encompassed dozens of potential violations, from creating immortal children who could not control their urges and who drew attention through their eternally childish bodies and their devastating powers, to waging wars that left evidence of supernatural combat, to feeding patterns that suggested predators were operating in areas where disappearances should remain explainable as conventional crime or natural disaster, rather than systematic hunting by immortal creatures. Their reputation grew through the centuries as stories spread about the Volturi's power and their ruthlessness, and their complete unwillingness to accept excuses or to grant second chances to those who violated the law, whether through ignorance or through deliberate defiance. Vampires learned to fear the name Volturi before they ever encountered the reality. The legend of the three brothers and their guard becoming cautionary tale that newborn vampires heard from their makers, and that ancient covens remembered from personal experience with the enforcers who had established themselves as supreme authority over vampire civilization. The fear was intentional and carefully cultivated. Aro, understanding that reputation made actual enforcement easier when most vampires would rather police themselves and police their associates than risk drawing Volturi attention and facing Volturi judgment in the throne room at Volterra, where so many vampires had been destroyed for crimes against the law that protected them all, whether they appreciated that protection or resented the restrictions that came with it. The Romanian coven existed as everything the Volturi opposed and everything they had sworn to eliminate from vampire civilization. Their empire built openly across Eastern Europe, with castles that humans recognized as supernatural strongholds, and with systems of human subjugation so visible and so brutal that folklore and legends spread across the continent, carrying warnings about the pale immortals who ruled the night and demanded tribute in blood and in lives from villages that had no choice but to comply or face extermination. Vladimir and Stefan had built their power over centuries before the Volturi even formed their alliance, their reign pretenning Greek philosophy and Roman engineering, their claim to supremacy based on age and strength and the sheer accumulated violence of their long existence rather than on any philosophical justification or any concern for vampire survival beyond their own personal dominance over territories they claimed through conquest and held through terror that kept both humans and lesser vampires subservient to their whims. The Romanian castles stood as monuments to vampire arrogance and vampire visibility, stone fortresses where Vladimir and Stefan held court, surrounded by their own guard of powerful vampires who enforced their master's will across regions where humans lived as cattle, and where vampire law meant whatever the Romanians declared it to mean, in service of their appetites and their entertainments and their casual cruelty toward both the mortals they fed upon and the immortals who served them, or who made the mistake of challenging their authority in territories they had claimed as their eternal domain. They kept humans as slaves in their castles, generations living and dying in service to vampires who did not bother hiding their nature or their feeding, because the humans they controlled had no escape and no hope of resistance against creatures who could move faster than human eyes could track, and who could kill with casual ease that made rebellion seem not just futile, but suicidal for any mortal brave enough or desperate enough to attempt it. The exposure risk was catastrophic from the Volturi's perspective. Vladimir and Stefan's empire representing exactly the kind of visible supernatural tyranny that would eventually provoke organized human response once humanity developed sufficient technology and sufficient organizational capacity to mount effective resistance against immortal predators whose only real vulnerability was their relatively small numbers compared to the human population that could overwhelm them through sheer mass and through coordinated attacks that exploited the vampires' need to feed and their arrogance about their own invulnerability. The Romanians dismissed these concerns when other vampires raised them. Their confidence in their own power making them blind to the long-term existential threat they posed not just to themselves, but to every vampire whose existence depended on humanity remaining ignorant, or at least uncertain about the reality of immortal predators living among them and feeding on them with regularity that created patterns any sufficiently motivated human observer could recognize and exploit. Aro saw the Romanians as both threat and opportunity, their brutal visible empire representing the old way that had to be destroyed if vampires were to survive the coming centuries when human population growth and human technological advancement would make secrecy increasingly difficult and would make visible vampire strongholds increasingly vulnerable to human attack, coordinated across regions and supported by emerging nation-states with resources and organization that individual villages had never possessed. But their destruction would also serve another purpose beyond securing vampire secrecy. Their defeat would establish the Volturi as supreme power in the vampire world and would demonstrate to every other coven that resistance to Volturi authority was futile, and that the old order of territorial tyranny and visible supernatural rule had ended permanently with no possibility of return to the chaos that had characterized vampire civilization before the three brothers established their governance. The ideological conflict was fundamental and irreconcilable. Vladimir and Stefan believing that vampires were apex predators who owed nothing to humanity except death, and who deserved to rule openly as the superior species, that they clearly were based on their strength and their immortality, and their freedom from the weaknesses that made humans fragile and temporary, and beneath consideration as anything except food and entertainment. The Volturi believed, or at least claimed to believe, that vampire survival required secrecy and required hiding among the human population rather than ruling over it. That exposure would lead to extinction once humanity organized against the common threat. That civilization for vampires meant restraint and concealment and laws that protected the species, even when those laws restricted individual covens' freedom to operate as they pleased, without regard for collective security or long-term survival. The preparation for war consumed decades or perhaps centuries, depending on how one measured the beginning of the conflict. Aro's strategic planning requiring patience and careful accumulation of resources and allies that could match the Romanians' own considerable guard, and could overcome the advantages of age and experience that Vladimir and Stefan possessed from their millennia of existence and their centuries of practice in vampire combat and vampire politics. The Volturi recruited systematically during this period, seeking out gifted vampires whose abilities would prove useful in the coming confrontation, and using Chelsea's gift to bind them to the Volturi cause with loyalty that felt genuine to those experiencing it, but that was carefully manufactured and constantly maintained to prevent defection or wavering commitment when the actual fighting began and casualties mounted, and the cost of challenging the Romanian Empire became undeniable and terrible. The acquisition of Jane and Alec represented the turning point in the Volturi's preparation. The twins' gifts so devastating and so perfectly suited to combat against older, stronger vampires that their addition to the guard made victory against the Romanians not just possible, but probable, despite the enormous gulf in age and accumulated power between the ancient Romanian rulers and the relatively younger Volturi, who had existed for mere centuries rather than millennia. The twins' human story was tragedy that Aro transformed into weapon. their villagers attempt to burn them as witches during one of humanity's periodic panics about supernatural evil in their midst, providing Aro with opportunity to save them through transformation that occurred just as the flames began to consume their bound bodies on the pyre that should have ended their lives, but instead began their immortal existence in service to the vampires who had rescued them from human cruelty and human fear. Jane's gift manifested as the ability to create illusion of pain so intense that even ancient vampires crumbled under its assault, her victims experiencing agony that felt completely real despite being entirely mental projection that left no physical damage, but that incapacitated even the strongest opponents through sheer overwhelming sensory input that the vampire brain interpreted as genuine torture happening to their indestructible bodies. Alec's complementary gift was perhaps even more useful in combat situations. His ability to cut off all senses from his targets, creating zones of complete sensory deprivation where victims lost sight and hearing, and even their supernatural senses of smell and awareness, rendering them helpless and vulnerable to physical attack from enemies they could neither see nor hear nor smell approaching, until teeth found throat and dismemberment began, before awareness could return, or defense could be mounted against assault they never saw coming. The other strategic additions to the guard during the preparation period included Dimitri, whose tracking ability made it impossible for Romanian allies to hide or flee once the war began, Felix, whose physical strength exceeded even normal vampire capabilities and whose combat skills made him devastating in direct confrontation, and Renata, whose shielding ability protected Aro specifically from physical and mental attacks that might target the leader whose death would fracture the Volturi's leadership structure and potentially end their challenge to Romanian supremacy before victory could be achieved. Each addition strengthened the Volturi's capabilities in specific ways that address specific weaknesses or enhance specific advantages. Aro's planning accounting for scenarios and contingencies that might arise during the conflict, and ensuring that they had answers to whatever strategies the Romanians might employ to defend their empire and their power. Chelsea's role during this period was perhaps more important than the combat-oriented gifts that other Guard members provided. Her manipulation of emotional bonds, allowing the Volturi to steal Romanian allies and to weaken the loyalty structure that held the Romanian Guard together under Vladimir and Stefan's leadership. She worked subtly and continuously, severing bonds between the Romanian leaders and their followers, while strengthening those vampires' feelings of connection to the Volturi, or at least weakening their commitment to fighting for masters who had never inspired genuine loyalty, but only fear and obligation that Chelsea's gift could undermine until defection seemed not just possible, but preferable to continued service to the doomed empire that the Volturi would inevitably destroy. The psychological warfare was as important as the physical combat capabilities. The erosion of Romanian support network creating conditions where their numerical advantages disappeared, and where their centuries of accumulated alliances proved worthless, when those allies decided that survival meant abandoning Vladimir and Stefan to face the Volturi alone, or with significantly reduced forces that could not match the coordinated assault that Aro had been planning for generations. Marcus during this period had Didim, his mate whose gift of inducing happiness in those around her made her beloved among the Volturi Guard, and made Marcus himself more engaged and more vital to the organization than he would ever be again after her death. That was still years or decades, or perhaps centuries away, depending on the timeline that remains unclear, even to those who remember the war and its aftermath. Didym's presence made Marcus an active participant in the planning and the execution of the Romanian campaign. His gift of perceiving relationships proving invaluable in identifying which bonds could be broken and which allies could be turned, and which members of the Romanian Guard were genuinely loyal, versus those who served only through fear or through lack of better alternatives that the Volturi could provide if approached correctly with offers of mercy or power, or simply survival in exchange for betrayal or neutrality during the coming conflict. The war itself, when it finally came, was not a single battle, but a coordinated campaign of strikes against Romanian strongholds and Romanian allies. The Volturi, moving systematically to eliminate the support structure before confronting Vladimir and Stefan directly in battles that would determine supremacy once the outcome could no longer be avoided through diplomacy or intimidation. They burned the castles that had stood as symbols of Romanian power, the stone fortresses destroyed so thoroughly that even ruins would not remain to inspire future vampires to rebuild the old empire or to challenge the new order that the Volturi were establishing through violence that exceeded even Romanian brutality in its efficiency and its finality. They executed Romanian Guard members who refused to surrender or who seemed likely to cause future problems even if they submitted to Volturi authority in the immediate aftermath of defeat. Aro's reading of their minds giving him complete knowledge of their loyalties and their future intentions, and their likelihood of accepting the new regime versus plotting revenge or rebellion that would require later attention and later violence to suppress. The psychological warfare was devastating to the Romanian leadership. Watching their allies abandon them or turn against them under Chelsea's influence, creating sense of betrayal and isolation that weakened their will to fight even as their physical power remained formidable. The ancient vampires discovering that age and strength meant nothing when facing enemies who could manipulate the very bonds that made leadership possible and that made armies effective rather than simply collections of individuals fighting without coordination or shared purpose. Vladimir and Stefan fought with the desperation of rulers watching their empire collapse around them. Their centuries of dominance ending in flames and screams and the systematic destruction of everything they had built across their long existence as vampire royalty. Who had never imagined that younger vampires would successfully challenge their supremacy and their right to rule as they pleased without concern for laws or civilization or the collective survival of the vampire species. The final confrontation left Vladimir and Stefan alive. Their survival, not mercy, but calculated message from Aro, who understood that living defeated enemies served as better warnings than dead martyrs whose deaths might inspire future resistance or future attempts to restore Romanian power. They were stripped of their guard and their territory and their power, reduced to wandering remnants of former glory whose bitterness and whose hatred of the Volturi would last for millennia, but whose actual capacity to threaten Volturi supremacy had been eliminated so thoroughly that their continued existence posed no real danger beyond the psychological satisfaction they might derive from witnessing any future Volturi failure or defeat. Aro let them live because their suffering served his purposes better than their deaths would have. their eternal humiliation demonstrating what happened to those who opposed the Volturi and lost, their powerless rage making clear that challenging the new order would result not in glorious battle and honorable death, but in survival stripped of everything that made existence bearable for immortals accustomed to power and respect and fear from those around them. The Volturi's victory was complete and absolute. Their ascension to supreme power in the vampire world accomplished through combination of military might and psychological manipulation and strategic planning that had accounted for every contingency and every possible Romanian response. They established themselves in Volterra as the undisputed center of vampire civilization, their authority no longer theoretical or aspirational but demonstrated fact that no other coven could reasonably challenge without facing destruction, similar to what had befallen the Romanians and their empire that had seemed eternal, until the Volturi proved that nothing was eternal except perhaps the Volturi themselves, and the laws they would enforce across the vampire world for the next 2,000 years. The establishment of Volturi rule across the vampire world, following their victory over the Romanians, required decades of consolidation and enforcement, their authority needing constant demonstration and constant vigilance against covens that might test the new order's strength, or might attempt to exploit any perceived weakness in the leadership structure that had replaced the old Romanian tyranny with new Volturi governance that claimed moral superiority through its emphasis on secrecy and species survival, rather than open predation and visible supernatural dominance. They traveled extensively during these early centuries of their reign, appearing personally to judge covens accused of violating the fundamental law, or to execute vampires who created immortal children, or who threatened exposure through carelessness or through deliberate defiance of the restrictions that the Volturi had imposed on vampire behavior across territories that now answered to Volterra, rather than to local strongmen who had previously operated without oversight or accountability to any higher authority. The structure of their government emerged gradually through practice and through necessity, the three leaders forming the core decision-making body, with Aro's telepathy providing complete information about accused vampires and their crimes, Marcus's perception of relationships revealing conspiracies and alliances that might threaten Volturi stability, and Caius's enthusiasm for violence ensuring that punishments were severe enough to deter future violations and to maintain the fear that kept most vampires compliant with laws they might privately resent, but that they dared not openly challenge. The Guard expanded to include dozens of vampires with various gifts and capabilities, their primary function being to project Volturi power across distances and to handle enforcement actions that did not require the personal attention of the three leaders who remained mostly in Volterra, conducting trials and passing judgments and maintaining the central authority that made their distributed power structure function effectively across the vampire world. The wives appeared during this period, Sulpicia claimed by Aro and Athenodora claimed by Caius, in relationships that observers might interpret as love or companionship, but that functioned practically as hostages masked as partners. Their presence in Volterra, ensuring that the leaders maintained connection to the castle and to each other, rather than pursuing separate interests or separate territories that might fracture the unified front that made the Volturi effective as governance structure rather than a simple alliance of convenience between three powerful vampires whose cooperation was essential. but whose individual ambitions might eventually conflict if not properly managed through bonds both emotional and strategic. Marcus had Didim during these early centuries, his sister-turned-mate whose gift of inducing happiness made her universally beloved among the guard and made Marcus himself a different vampire than he would become after her death. His engagement with Volturi business complete, and his philosophical insights valued by Aro, who relied on Marcus's perception of relationships to navigate the complex social and political dynamics that emerged as vampire civilization reorganized itself under their rule. The castle of Volterra became physical manifestation of their power and their permanence. The ancient structure expanded and modified to accommodate the guard and the constant stream of visitors who came seeking judgment or favor, or simply to demonstrate their submission to the authority that now governed their existence, whether they appreciated that governance or resented the restrictions it imposed. The throne room was designed for theater and intimidation. The three leaders sitting in massive chairs elevated above the floor where accused vampires would stand to face judgment. The architecture emphasizing the power differential and the futility of resistance against rulers who had destroyed the Romanians and who commanded gifts and forces that made challenging their decisions seem not just dangerous, but absolutely suicidal for anyone foolish enough to attempt it. The underground chambers served darker purposes, feeding rooms where tourists were brought to die and supply the guards' needs, torture spaces where enhanced interrogation might extract information or confessions, storage areas for the accumulated wealth and art that the Volturi collected across centuries of existence at civilization's center. The immortal children lore emerged from necessity and from tragedy. The Volturi discovering through painful experience that vampires created from human children could not be controlled or taught restraint, their mental development frozen at whatever age they had been transformed, making them eternally impulsive and eternally dangerous as their supernatural strength and speed combined with childish inability to delay gratification or to understand consequences or to hide their nature from human observers, who would inevitably notice that certain children never aged and never grew and possessed strength that no human child should possess. The law's enforcement was brutal and absolute. Entire covens destroyed for creating even a single immortal child, regardless of the circumstances or the intentions. The Volturi's response to these violations consistently involving execution of the child, an execution of the creator, and often execution of anyone who had known about the child's existence without reporting it to Volterra for proper handling. The message was clear and unambiguous. Immortal children threaten species survival through their uncontrollable nature and their visibility. Creating them was unforgivable crime punishable by immediate death, without possibility of mercy or appeal or explanation that might justify the violation. The trials during this consolidation period established precedents and demonstrated Volturi justice to the vampire world. Their proceedings in the throne room becoming legendary for their combination of apparent fairness in hearing evidence combined with predetermined outcomes that Aro's mind reading had already established before the accused vampire even entered the room to face judgment. They executed violators with theatrical efficiency, the dismemberment and burning serving both practical purposes of permanent destruction and symbolic purposes of warning other vampires about the consequences of breaking laws or challenging authority. They granted clemency occasionally and strategically, sparing gifted vampires whose abilities might prove useful or sparing those whose destruction would create more problems than their survival posed. Aro's calculations about cost and benefit determining outcomes more often than any abstract principle of justice or mercy that might have guided less pragmatic rulers. Marcus and Didym's relationship deepened through these centuries of consolidation, their bond visible to Marcus's own gift as the strongest connection in the throne room, and perhaps the strongest connection Marcus had ever perceived in his long existence. Her presence making his immortality bearable and giving him purpose beyond the endless cycle of judgment and execution that characterized Volturi business, and that might otherwise have made his existence feel empty, despite the power and the influence that came with his position as one of the 3 leaders who ruled vampire civilization. Didym's gift of inducing happiness worked constantly on those around her, her presence making the guard more content and more loyal beyond even Chelsea's manipulation, her effect on Marcus transforming him from the philosophical but somewhat detached observer he had been before her transformation into someone genuinely engaged with the world and with the future, and with the possibility that immortality might contain joy rather than simply endless repetition of the same patterns across centuries that blurred together into indistinguishable succession of identical moments. But Didymi wanted to leave, her happiness gift not protecting her from boredom or from desire for experiences beyond Volterra's stone walls, and beyond the endless parade of trials and executions that filled their nights, and that filled Marcus's attention with responsibilities that prevented the travel and the exploration, and the simple freedom that she craved despite understanding intellectually that abandoning the Volturi would weaken their structure, and would set precedent that might encourage others to leave, and that might eventually undermine the unified front that made their rule effective and unchallengeable. She spoke to Marcus about her desires during private moments, her dreams of seeing the world beyond Italy and beyond the Mediterranean region, where they had spent centuries building and maintaining their power. Her wish to experience vampire existence without the constant weight of governance and judgment, and the accumulated violence that stained everything they did, regardless of how necessary that violence might be for maintaining order and preventing exposure. Marcus felt torn between his love for Didymi and his loyalty to the Volturi and to Aro, who had been his friend and his partner in building vampire civilization from the chaos that had preceded their rule, his philosophical nature making him acutely aware of the competing obligations and the impossibility of satisfying everyone's needs when Didym's happiness required leaving, and the Volturi's stability required his staying and his continuing to provide his gifts insight into relationships and alliances that Aro could not perceive through telepathy alone. He began to seriously consider departure despite the consequences, his love for Didym outweighing his commitment to the organization he had helped create, and his willingness to abandon power and influence if that abandonment meant preserving the relationship that had become more important to him than any amount of authority or any amount of respect from the vampire world that they governed. Aro learned of their plans through his gift during some moment of physical contact that gave him access to Marcus's thoughts and Marcus's internal conflict and Marcus's decision to eventually leave with Didymi, regardless of how that departure might damage the Volturi's leadership structure and might encourage others to view service to the organization as temporary, rather than eternal commitment that could not be broken without permission, that Aro would never grant to someone as essential as Marcus had become. The realization created impossible choice for Aro, whose ambition and whose vision of vampire civilization had always taken precedence over personal relationships or personal attachments that might interfere with building and maintaining the power structure that would govern vampires for millennia, and that would ensure species survival through enforced secrecy and enforced compliance with laws designed to prevent exposure. The decision happened in private moments that only Aro knows completely. His choice to murder his own sister to prevent losing Marcus, representing the ultimate subordination of personal bonds to political necessity and organizational stability. His calculation that Marcus, bound by grief and by Chelsea's manipulation, would serve the Volturi better than no Marcus at all, and certainly better than Marcus departed with Didyme to live independently, while the remaining two leaders tried to maintain authority structure designed for 3 and now reduced to 2 through defection that might inspire others to leave or to challenge their rule. Didym's death was staged or explained as accident, or perhaps as attack by enemies unknown. The cover story maintained even centuries later, despite whispers and suspicions among guard members, who understood that convenient accidents rarely happened to vampires as powerful and as protected as Didyme had been, within Volterra's walls, and within the security that should have made her immune to any threat, except the one that came from her own brother, who loved power more than he loved her life. Marcus's descent into apathy was immediate and total. His discovery of Didym's death destroying something fundamental in his personality and his engagement with existence. His grief so profound and so permanent that thousands of years later he would still sit in the throne room, wishing for death that would never come, and that Chelsea's gift prevented him from pursuing through the simple expedient of walking into sunlight or provoking someone into destroying him and ending the suffering that had become his eternal companion. Chelsea's manipulation kept him bound to the Volturi, despite his desire to follow Didyme into whatever oblivion awaited destroyed vampires. Her gift severing or weakening his bond to his own autonomy, while strengthening his sense of obligation to remain in his position serving the organization that had cost him everything that made immortality worth experiencing. He became hollow presence in the throne room, his body present and his gift still functioning, but his consciousness elsewhere, or simply gone into internal spaces where grief lived eternally, and where Didym's absence created void that nothing could fill across the subsequent 2,000 years of his continued existence. Caius's cruelty intensified during this period, as if compensating for Marcus's withdrawal, or perhaps simply expressing his own nature without Marcus's moderating philosophical influence tempering the violence that Caius preferred as solution to most problems and as appropriate response to most challenges. The wives retreated into their tower, their roles crystallizing into permanent captivity, masked as protection and masked as honored positions, when the reality was that they were hostages ensuring the leaders' continued cooperation and continued presence in Volterra, rather than pursuing individual interests that might fracture the unified leadership structure. The Children of the Moon existed as vampires' only true natural predator. Their species transformed by lunar cycles into creatures whose strength matched vampire power, and whose teeth could tear through vampire flesh with efficiency, that made combat between the two supernatural species roughly equal in outcome, depending on circumstances and numbers and terrain that might favor one side over the other, during confrontations that typically ended with one party destroyed entirely rather than with retreat or truce that would preserve both combatants for future encounters. They were true werewolves in the classical sense that folklore and legend described. Humans who transformed involuntarily during full moon into massive wolves that retain no human consciousness or human restraint during their lunar periods of change, when instinct and rage controlled their actions and made them dangerous to vampires and humans alike, with no discrimination or recognition of allies versus enemies during the hours when moonlight triggered their transformation into bestial form that possessed supernatural strength and supernatural speed and healing capacity that rivaled vampire regeneration. The werewolf transformation occurred monthly with the full moon's rising, the affected humans losing control completely as their bodies shifted into wolf shape, perhaps 3 times the size of natural wolves, with corresponding increases in strength and aggression and killing capacity that made them formidable opponents even for ancient vampires whose accumulated experience and skill could be overwhelmed by pure animalistic ferocity, combined with physical capabilities that negated the advantages that vampires typically enjoyed over mortal creatures. The werewolves in their transformed state could not be reasoned with or negotiated with or controlled by any means known to vampire civilization, their lack of conscious thought making them immune to gifts that worked on minds or emotions or relationships, their pure physical nature requiring pure physical combat to defeat or survive until the moon set, and transformation reversed, leaving behind human, who might not even remember the violence committed during the hours of change. The duration of transformation lasted from moonrise to moonset, during the 3 nights surrounding the full moon when lunar influence was strongest, the werewolves spending approximately 8 to 10 hours in their wolf form each night during this period when they posed maximum danger to any vampire unfortunate enough to encounter them in remote forests or mountain regions, where both species hunted and where territorial disputes became inevitable given the limited spaces where supernatural predators could operate without excessive human attention. The werewolf's strength during transformation exceeded normal vampire capabilities by sufficient margin that even ancient vampires approached these encounters with caution and with backup from coven members who could assist if the combat turned against them. The stories of vampires destroyed by werewolf packs serving as warnings about underestimating opponents whose bestial nature masked intelligence and pack coordination that made them far more dangerous than simple animals, despite their loss of human reasoning during transformed state. Early conflicts between vampires and werewolves were inevitable, given that both species viewed humans as resources or prey, and that both species operated in similar territories where human populations provided sustenance for vampires and unwitting victims for werewolves, whose transformation periods created patterns of violence that drew attention, and created folklore and created danger of exposure that affected vampires even when werewolves were the actual cause of the mysterious deaths and disappearances that occurred with lunar regularity in regions where children of the moon lived among human populations. The conflicts escalated over centuries as territorial disputes and revenge killings and simple mutual hatred created cycles of violence that neither species could easily break or ignore when encountering members of the other supernatural species during their respective hunting or feeding activities that brought them into contact despite both sides, preferring to avoid confrontations that carried genuine risk of death for combatants who had assumed their immortality or their monthly transformations made them invulnerable to permanent harm. Caius's personal vendetta against the werewolf species originated in an encounter that left him scarred permanently. His vampire body somehow damaged beyond the normal healing capabilities that made vampires virtually indestructible to conventional injury. The mysterious scars on his face and hands testimony to werewolf attack that had nearly destroyed him, and that had left him with permanent physical reminders of vulnerability and mortality that other vampires never had to contemplate or acknowledge. The details of the attack remain unclear, even to those who serve in the Volturi Guard. Caius refusing to discuss the incident that created his scars and created his hatred that would fuel centuries of genocidal warfare against the children of the moon, long after any strategic justification for their extermination had ceased to exist beyond Caius's personal need for revenge against the species that had marked him as different, even among the beautiful monsters who populated vampire society and who valued physical perfection as both aesthetic ideal and practical advantage in their interactions with humans and with each other. The attack presumably happened during Caius's early vampire years before he joined with Aro and Marcus to form the Volturi, his youth and inexperience making him vulnerable to werewolf pack that caught him alone during full moon period, when their numbers and their ferocity overwhelmed his vampire advantages and left him broken and scarred and forever changed by the encounter that taught him fear and taught him that vampire superiority was not absolute and that creatures existed who could match vampire power and could inflict permanent damage that even centuries of existence would not heal or erase. The psychological trauma of the attack perhaps exceeded the physical damage. Caius's pride and his sense of invulnerability shattered by the discovery that he could be hurt and could be marked and could carry visible evidence of defeat that other vampires would see and would recognize as proof that he had been bested by creatures that vampire culture dismissed as inferior beasts, unworthy of respect or caution. The decision to eliminate werewolves as species was presented as strategic necessity for vampire security. The Volturi arguing that werewolf existence threatened vampire secrecy through the violence and the attention that transformations created in human populations who witnessed attacks or discovered evidence of supernatural predation that occurred with monthly regularity in areas where children of the moon operated. But the true motivation was clearly Caius's rage and his desire to punish the entire species for the injury that one werewolf or one pack had inflicted upon him during his vulnerable period as young vampire before he had accumulated the combat experience and the tactical awareness that would have prevented the near-fatal encounter that left him scarred and traumatized and filled with hatred that millennia have done nothing to diminish or moderate into something resembling acceptance or forgiveness, or even rational assessment of whether exterminating entire species served any purpose beyond satisfying his personal need for revenge. The werewolf genocide consumed centuries of effort and resources. The Volturi, organizing systematic hunting expeditions that tracked children of the moon across continents and across centuries as the werewolf population declined from hundreds, or perhaps thousands to dozens, to the handful that survived into the modern era by maintaining extraordinary secrecy and extraordinary caution about their transformations and their visibility. The hunting parties consisted of Volturi guard members dispatched specifically to locate and destroy werewolves wherever they could be found. The tactics evolving over time as werewolves learned to hide more effectively, and as vampires learned to predict transformation patterns and lunar cycles, and the territorial behaviors that made tracking possible for vampires with gifts like Dimitri's ability to follow supernatural signatures across vast distances and across time periods that would have made conventional tracking impossible for hunters relying on physical trails or conventional investigative methods. The campaigns required patience and coordination across decades as hunting parties followed rumors and reports and patterns of lunar violence that suggested werewolf presence in regions where the Volturi then concentrated their efforts until the local werewolf population had been eliminated completely through systematic hunting that left no survivors to reproduce or to pass on the curse that created new werewolves through methods that remained mysterious even to vampires who had studied the species extensively. The werewolf condition appeared to be hereditary in some cases and transmissible through bite in other cases. The inconsistent transmission methods making complete extermination difficult when any surviving werewolf might create new werewolves, either through reproduction or through violent encounters with humans who survived the initial attack, but who carried the curse forward into future generations that would transform during full moons and would require subsequent hunting expeditions to eliminate. The cost of the werewolf wars included guard members lost to combat during full moon periods, when transformed werewolves possessed advantages that made them dangerous even to experienced vampire warriors. The casualties rare but devastating when they occurred, because vampire society had no traditions or frameworks for dealing with permanent death of warriors who should have been immortal and invulnerable to anything except deliberate dismemberment and burning by other vampires who chose to destroy them for violations or for strategic purposes. The deaths of guard members in werewolf combat represented failures that the Volturi acknowledged privately, while maintaining public position that their forces were invincible and that challenging their authority meant certain destruction for anyone foolish enough to attempt resistance or rebellion against the established order. The violence required to exterminate a species was extraordinary even by vampire standards accustomed to brutality and execution. The systematic nature of the genocide requiring commitment and resources that the Volturi maintained across centuries when other priorities might have seemed more urgent or more relevant to vampire civilization's actual needs beyond satisfying Caius's personal vendetta and his psychological need to eliminate the creatures who had scarred him and who reminded him through their continued existence of his own vulnerability and his own mortality that vampire nature was supposed to transcend, but the werewolf teeth had somehow pierced. The hunting parties killed werewolves in their human forms when possible to avoid the dangers of confronting transformed opponents. The ethical implications of murdering humans who had not yet transformed and who might not even know they carried the werewolf curse being dismissed by the Volturi as irrelevant when the alternative was allowing potential werewolves to survive and transform and create the combat situations that had already cost vampire lives and that threatened to cost more if the extermination was not pursued with absolute thoroughness. The brutal efficiency of the campaign reflected Volturi methods and Volturi resources, their ability to coordinate across territories and across centuries, making them uniquely capable of pursuing extermination effort that required tracking scattered populations and maintaining pressure across generations. When individual covens might have lost interest or might have concluded that coexistence was possible if both species maintained sufficient distance and sufficient caution about exposure risks. The near-total extermination succeeded in making werewolves so rare that most modern vampires have never encountered one, and believe them to be extinct or legendary, rather than actual species that once posed genuine threat to vampire security and vampire supremacy over the supernatural world's hierarchy of predators and powers that might challenge vampire dominance if left unchecked or unmanaged by authorities willing to use violence to maintain the order that benefited vampire survival. Caius's satisfaction with the genocide's success did nothing to moderate his continued paranoia about werewolf survival, or his continued enthusiasm for hunting any rumored children of the moon that might have escaped the centuries of systematic extermination that he had orchestrated and maintained through sheer force of will and through his position within the Volturi leadership structure that gave him resources and authority to pursue personal vendettas under the guise of protecting vampire security and vampire secrecy from threats that he identified as requiring violent response regardless of whether other vampires agreed with his assessment or his methods, or his obsessive dedication to eliminating every last werewolf from existence, even when the practical threat they posed had been reduced to near zero through the successful hunting campaigns that had destroyed most of their population. The medieval period presented new challenges for maintaining vampire secrecy as human civilization recovered from the collapse of Roman authority and began developing new organizational structures and new cultural institutions that increased literacy and record keeping and the ability to notice patterns in disappearances and deaths that might suggest supernatural predation if the patterns became too obvious or too regular in specific locations or specific time periods that drew investigative attention from religious authorities or secular leaders who commanded resources sufficient to make vampire existence uncomfortable or dangerous. If human suspicion became human certainty about the reality of immortal predators living hidden among mortal populations. The witch trials that swept through Europe during various periods of religious fervor and social panic sometimes caught actual immortals among the accused. Vampires who had been careless or unlucky, finding themselves bound and facing fire that could destroy them if they could not escape before the flames consumed their bodies beyond the point where regeneration was possible, or before other vampires could intervene to rescue them from human justice that occasionally stumbled upon actual supernatural threats among the many innocent humans accused and executed for imaginary crimes and imaginary connections to demonic powers. The Volturi monitored these situations carefully and intervened when exposure seemed imminent, their agents sometimes rescuing vampires from human justice and sometimes allowing the executions to proceed if the accused vampire had been sufficiently careless or sufficiently visible that their destruction served as useful lesson to other vampires about the importance of discretion and the consequences of attracting human attention through feeding patterns or behavioral choices that violated the fundamental law requiring secrecy above all other considerations that might influence vampire behavior or vampire choices about how to exist within human civilization, without revealing their true nature to populations that would panic and organize against them if given proof that monsters were real and were living among them. Carlyle Cullen arrived in Volterra during the 1700s, when the city still maintained its medieval character, and when the Volturi had been established as supreme vampire authority for over a millennium, his appearance at their doors representing curiosity rather than necessity, his interest in meeting the famous vampire rulers driven by intellectual fascination and by desire to understand how vampire civilization functioned at its highest levels, rather than by any legal trouble or any summons requiring his presence before the three leaders who judged violations and dispensed justice from their throne room, where so many vampires had faced their final moments before being dismembered and burned for crimes against the laws that protected vampire secrecy and vampire survival. He was young by vampire standards, transformed perhaps 2 centuries earlier by circumstances that had left him alone and searching for meaning in his immortal existence. His discovery that he could survive on animal blood rather than human blood, making him unusual enough to attract the Volturi attention when rumors of the compassionate doctor who refused to kill humans reached Volterra through the networks of gossip and information that kept the rulers informed about interesting developments in vampire society across the territories they governed. Aro's fascination with Carlyle emerged immediately upon their first meeting, the mind reader's gift revealing through physical contact the extraordinary self-control and the genuine compassion that motivated Carlyle's vegetarian lifestyle choice that most vampires would consider impossible or at minimum undesirable. Given that animal blood provided inferior sustenance and inferior satisfaction compared to human blood, that vampires were designed by their transformation to crave and to consume without guilt or hesitation or moral consideration for the lives they were ending to sustain their own immortal existence. The philosophical discussions between Aro and Carlyle continued for decades as the young doctor remained in Volterra as guest rather than prisoner. Their debates about vampire nature and vampire morality and vampire responsibility toward humanity, creating intellectual stimulation that Aro rarely experienced, given that most vampires he encountered either feared him too much to speak honestly or lacked the education and the philosophical background to engage meaningfully with questions about what immortal predators owe to their mortal prey beyond the mercy of quick deaths and minimal suffering during the feeding process that sustained vampire existence across centuries and millennia. Carlyle studied the Volturi. During his extended stay that lasted several decades, during which he lived within the castle and observed their operations and their governance from perspective that few outside vampires ever achieved, his unique position as Aro's intellectual companion and philosophical sparring partner, giving him access to the inner workings of vampire civilization's ruling body and insight into how they maintain their authority across the vast territories they claim to govern, through combination of fear and respect and the devastating gifts that made challenging their decisions seem suicidal for any coven that might resent their restrictions or might disagree with their interpretation of what laws were necessary to protect vampire secrecy and vampire survival. He witnessed executions and trials that demonstrated the violence underlying their civilized facade, watched as vampires who had violated fundamental law, or who had created immortal children, or who had drawn human attention through carelessness faced judgment in the throne room, where Oro read their minds and Marcus observed their relationships, and Caius advocated for maximum violence in nearly every case regardless of mitigating circumstances or possibilities for mercy. But Carlyle also saw their necessity during his time in Volterra, his practical wisdom recognizing that vampire civilization required governance and required enforcement of laws that protected the species from exposure, even when those laws seemed harsh, or when their enforcement seemed excessive in specific cases where mercy might have served justice. Better than destruction served the cause of maintaining order through fear that kept most vampires compliant with restrictions they might privately resent. He understood that without the Volturi's authority, vampires would likely return to the chaos that had characterized the pre-Volturi era, when exposure was constant threat, and when vampire wars created evidence and created legends that threatened species survival through their visibility and their disregard for human awareness of the supernatural predators living among mortal populations who were beginning to develop scientific methods and investigative capabilities that would make vampire secrecy increasingly difficult to maintain if the species operated without coordination or without enforceable standards of behavior. The accumulated wealth and art that filled Volterra's castle impressed Carlyle with its scope and its sophistication. The Volturi's 3,000 years of existence allowing them to collect masterpieces and treasures from civilizations across human history. Their aesthetic appreciation genuine, even if their methods of acquisition sometimes involve violence or intimidation, or the simple reality that immortal collectors could outlast and outbid any human competitors for the objects they desired. Aro showed Carlyle his collections with obvious pride, the ancient vampire's pleasure in sharing his accumulated knowledge and his accumulated beauty with someone who could appreciate them intellectually and aesthetically, rather than simply as displays of wealth or power, making the conversations between them feel like genuine friendship, despite the enormous gulf in age and power and philosophical orientation that separated the compassionate doctor from the ruthless ruler. Aro's attempt to recruit Carlyle represented the collector's desire to possess the compassionate doctor's unique perspective and his unusual gift of extreme self-control that allowed the vegetarian lifestyle that other vampires considered theoretically possible but practically unbearable given the constant temptation of human blood and human suffering that vampire nature seemed designed to crave with intensity that made resistance feel like fighting against fundamental aspects of immortal existence. The offer was genuine and generous, Aro promising Carlyle position within the Guard, an opportunity to influence Volturi policy, and access to resources and protection that came with serving the most powerful vampires in existence. His vision of having Carlyle's compassion and Carlyle's medical knowledge and Carlyle's unique philosophical perspective contributing to Volturi governance, representing sincere desire to improve their rule rather than simple collector obsession with acquiring rare abilities. But Carlyle refused with respectful firmness that impressed even Caius, who typically viewed refusal of Volturi offers as insult warranting violent response. His explanation that he needed to pursue his own path and his own understanding of what vampire existence could mean, receiving Aro's disappointed acceptance rather than the violent response that such refusal might have provoked if Carlyle had been less diplomatic, or if Aro had been less genuinely fond of the young doctor whose company he had enjoyed during the decades of philosophical discussion and mutual respect that had developed between them, despite their fundamental disagreements about vampire nature and vampire responsibilities. Aro understood through his gift's complete access to Carlyle's thoughts that the refusal represented genuine philosophical commitment rather than personal rejection or political calculation. The doctor's sincerity and his genuine respect for the Volturi, despite his disagreement with their methods, making the rejection bearable, even if disappointing to the ancient vampire who rarely encountered equals in intellectual discourse or in moral reasoning. Their parting was amicable despite Aro's disappointment, Carlyle leaving Volterra with the Volturi's blessing and with Aro's sincere friendship that would persist across the subsequent centuries, even as their ideological differences became more pronounced and even as Carlyle built his own coven, based on principles that directly contradicted Volturi assumptions about vampire nature and vampire capabilities and vampire relationships with humanity. Aro watched with fascination and with tolerant amusement as reports reached Volterra about Carlyle's growing family of vegetarian vampires, his collection of damaged individuals transformed and redeemed through his compassion and his willingness to offer them alternative to traditional vampire existence that required killing humans and that accepted violence and predation as inevitable consequences of immortal nature that could not be changed or moderated through will or through moral commitment that Carlyle seemed to believe could overcome even the most fundamental vampire instincts. The centuries passed with minimal direct contact between the Cullens and the Volturi, beyond occasional letters or brief visits when Carlyle's travels brought him near Italy and when his respect for his old friend prompted him to stop in Volterra to maintain the relationship that both vampires valued despite their philosophical differences. Their conversations during these visits, returning to the same debates about vampire nature and vampire morality that had characterized Carlyle's original extended stay, but now enriched by Carlyle's practical experience building and maintaining a coven of vegetarian vampires who seemed to thrive despite rejecting human blood and despite living in ways that conventional vampire wisdom suggested should be impossible or unbearable. Aro's curiosity about how Carlyle managed to inspire such loyalty and such commitment to the difficult vegetarian lifestyle in his coven members made him probe more deeply during these visits, his gift giving him access to Carlyle's thoughts about his family and his methods and his successes and failures in guiding damaged vampires toward redemption through compassion and through the belief that vampire existence did not require being monsters, even if vampire nature seemed designed for predation. The Cullens' growing coven attracted increasing attention as Carlyle added members who possessed remarkable gifts that would have interested the Volturi under any circumstances, but that became particularly notable when combined with the vegetarian lifestyle that suggested these powerful vampires had chosen compassion over traditional vampire values of strength and dominance and casual disregard for human life beyond its utility as food source that sustained vampire existence. Edward's telepathy represented gift that rivaled Aro's own ability, though limited to present thoughts rather than complete mental history, accessible through touch, his range and his precision making him formidable in ways that intrigued Aro, who had never encountered another telepath, and who wondered what it would be like to touch Edward's mind and to experience telepathy from the perspective of another mind reader whose gift functioned differently, but achieved similar results. Alice's precognition offered tactical advantages that would make any military force nearly invincible if properly utilized. Her visions of future possibilities based on current decisions, giving her ability to navigate complex situations and to avoid dangers before they materialized into actual threats requiring violent response or defensive action. Jasper's emotional manipulation provided crowd control capabilities that could prevent or incite violence depending on users' intentions. His gift developed and refined during the Southern Vampire Wars, where he had led newborn armies and had learned to manage the volatile emotions and the constant aggression that characterized newly transformed vampires whose control had not yet developed and whose instincts made them dangerous to everyone, including their own creators and commanders. The accumulated gifts within the Cullen Coven made them collectively more powerful than many covens twice their size, composed of vampires without special abilities beyond the standard vampire capabilities shared by all immortals. Their combination of gifts creating synergies that multiplied their effectiveness and made them formidable, despite their relatively small numbers and their commitment to vegetarian lifestyle that most vampires assumed would weaken them or would make them less capable in confrontations where strength and speed and ruthlessness determined outcomes. The incident with Bree Tanner and the newborn army in Seattle during the early 21st century represented the first direct Volturi intervention in Cullen affairs since Carlyle's departure from Volterra centuries earlier. Victoria's vendetta against Bella Swan, prompting the creation of newborn army that violated multiple laws through his visibility and his chaos, and his potential for exposing vampire existence to Seattle's human population, who are noticing the unprecedented murder rate and the strange disappearances that characterized the period when Victoria was building her army of unstable newborns for her planned attack on the Cullens, who had killed her mate James during his hunt of Bella Swan the previous year. The Volturi's awareness of the situation emerged through their information networks that monitored unusual vampire activity and unusual violence patterns that might threaten secrecy or might require intervention to prevent exposure or to punish violations of laws designed to prevent exactly the kind of chaos that newborn armies represented when their creators lost control, or when their violence drew human attention beyond the level that could be explained away as conventional crime or gang violence or serial killer activity. Their calculated delay in intervening until after the Cullens had handled the situation themselves represented strategic decision to allow the problem to resolve without requiring Volturi resources, while simultaneously creating opportunity to visit the Cullens and to assess their capabilities and to deliver warnings or to recruit members whose gifts Aro coveted for his collection. That already included the most powerful vampires in existence, but that could always accommodate additional talents if those talents proved sufficiently useful or sufficiently rare. Jane's disappointment at missing the fight was evident when the Volturi arrived to find the battle already concluded and the newborn army already destroyed, except for young Bree Tanner, whose survival presented the Volturi with convenient excuse to demonstrate their authority and to remind the Cullens that laws existed and that violations carried consequences regardless of extenuating circumstances or sympathetic individual cases that might inspire mercy in more compassionate authorities than the Volturi, who had built their reputation on absolute enforcement and zero tolerance for violations. The trial of Britannia was brief and brutal. The young newborn's genuine innocence and her lack of understanding about vampire law providing no protection against Volturi justice that recognized no exceptions and no mercy for violations of laws designed to prevent the chaos and the exposure that newborn armies represented to vampire civilization's security and survival. Felix executed her efficiently while the Cullens watched in horror, their protest dismissed by Aro, who explained with apparent regret that laws existed for reasons and that exceptions created precedents that undermined the absolute authority required to maintain order across vampire civilization, where any weakness or any inconsistency in enforcement could encourage others to test boundaries or to challenge restrictions that protected them all from human discovery and human retaliation. Jasper's military background revealed, during discussions about how the Cullens had defeated Victoria's army without suffering casualties, interested the Volturi guard members who recognized his tactical expertise and his combat experience that exceeded what most vampires accumulated even across centuries of existence. His past as leader of newborn armies in the Southern Vampire Wars, making him uniquely qualified to counter Victoria's strategy and making him potentially valuable asset if the Volturi could ever recruit him away from Carlyle's coven and Carlyle's vegetarian philosophy that seemed to inspire unusual loyalty among his followers, who chose to remain with him despite opportunities to join more powerful covens or to pursue traditional vampire lifestyles that would offer greater satisfaction and greater freedom from the constant struggle that vegetarian existence required. Irina's sighting of Renesmee happened on a winter morning when the Denali vampire was hunting in the forests near Forks. Her presence in the area motivated by grief over Laurent's death at the hands of the Quileute werewolves and by her complicated feelings toward the Cullens, who had been instrumental in her mate's destruction even if they had not personally killed him. Her decision to visit their territory representing attempted reconciliation, or perhaps simply morbid curiosity about the family whose choices had led to Laurent's permanent death and her permanent loss of the companion who had been with her for decades and who had represented stability in her long immortal existence that stretched back centuries to when she and her sisters Tanya and Kate had first been transformed and had first established their coven in the wilderness of Alaska, where they could maintain their chosen vegetarian lifestyle away from human populations that might tempt them or might notice their presence. She saw the child from distance playing in the snow with Bella and Jacob. The girl's appearance and her movements and her obvious supernatural nature triggering immediate recognition in Irina's mind of what immortal children looked like based on descriptions and warnings that every vampire learned during their education about fundamental laws and about violations that warranted immediate Volturi intervention and immediate execution of everyone involved in creating or harboring the illegal vampire whose existence threatened species survival through inevitable exposure that would come from the child's inability to control supernatural strength or supernatural appetites or supernatural visibility that no amount of parental supervision could adequately manage or contain across the decades and centuries of eternal childhood that would follow transformation. The mistake was understandable, given the circumstances, and given that hybrid children had never been documented or known to vampire civilization in the 3,000 years since Aro had begun keeping records and collecting information about vampire capabilities and vampire variations across the species, whose diversity in gifts and abilities never ceased to fascinate him, even after millennia of observation and study and accumulation of knowledge through his gift that gave him access to every thought and every memory of every vampire he touched throughout his long existence. Renesmee's rapid growth and her physical appearance at that moment suggested a child of perhaps 3 or 4 years old, despite being only months old chronologically. Her supernatural grace and her supernatural beauty and her presence in Cullen company, making the immortal child explanation seem obvious to observer who had no reason to suspect that half-human, half-vampire hybrids were possible, or that such creatures would develop and mature in ways completely different from immortal children, whose danger came from being frozen eternally at whatever age they had been transformed, with no possibility of mental or emotional development that would allow them to learn restraint or to understand consequences of their actions, when those actions involved supernatural strength, capable of killing humans and destroying property in ways that drew attention and created legends and created the exact exposure risk that vampire laws existed to prevent. Irina's grief and her anger toward the Cullens for their role in Laurent's death perhaps influenced her interpretation of what she was seeing. Her emotional state making her more likely to assume the worst and less likely to approach for clarification or to consider alternative explanations before taking action that would set in motion events that would nearly destroy both the Cullens and the Volturi, in catastrophic confrontation that neither side could afford, but that both sides seemed unable to avoid once the accusation had been made, and once Volturi pride and Volturi authority had been invoked in ways that made backing down seem impossible, without admitting error, or without appearing weak to the vampire world that watched constantly for any sign that the ancient rulers were losing their grip on power, or losing their willingness to enforce laws with the absolute ruthlessness that had characterized their reign since they had destroyed the Romanian Empire and established their supremacy over all vampire affairs, regardless of location or coven preference or lifestyle choices that individual vampires might wish to pursue. Her sisters Tanya and Kate would later express horror at what Irina had done without investigation, their understanding that she had acted from grief and from anger rather than from certainty about what she had witnessed, making them sympathetic to her motivations, even while recognizing that her actions had created crisis that threatened everyone she claimed to care about, including the Cullens, who had been their allies for decades. Her journey to Volterra represented both civic duty as vampire citizen, obligated to report violations of fundamental law, and personal revenge against the family whose choices had cost her the mate she had loved for centuries. Her motivations complex enough that even she might not have been able to articulate clearly why she chose to travel across the world to accuse the Cullens, rather than investigating further or approaching them directly to demand explanations before involving the authorities whose intervention would inevitably result in violence and death. regardless of whether the accusations proved accurate upon closer examination, or whether some misunderstanding or some unprecedented situation existed that would explain what she had witnessed in ways that did not involve violation of the immortal child law. The trip took weeks as she traveled by conventional means to avoid drawing attention. Her arrival in Volterra during late autumn, bringing her before the three leaders in their throne room, where she presented her testimony and her eyewitness account of seeing the Cullen family with an immortal child in direct violation of the law, whose enforcement had required destroying entire covens and burning immortal children, whose creators had doomed them to eternal childhood and eternal inability to control their supernatural strength or their supernatural appetites that made them dangerous to everyone around them and made their existence incompatible with vampire secrecy that protected the entire species from human discovery and human retaliation that would follow once humanity understood that immortal predators lived among them. The Volturi's reaction combined genuine concern about law violation with barely concealed excitement about opportunity to confront the Cullens and to finally acquire the gifts that Aro had coveted since learning about Edward's telepathy and Alice's precognition and the other remarkable abilities that the vegetarian coven had accumulated across their decades of existence together under Carlyle's leadership, and Carlyle's unusual philosophy about vampire nature and vampire responsibility toward humanity that contradicted everything conventional vampire culture taught about predator-prey relationships and about the fundamental nature of immortal existence. Aro's interest in the accusation was immediate and total, his mind racing through implications and possibilities and strategies for handling situation that might finally give him legitimate excuse to destroy or to forcibly recruit the Cullens, whose continued independence had always irritated him despite his friendship with Carlyle and despite his tolerant amusement at their vegetarian experiment that had succeeded beyond what anyone had predicted when Carlyle first began building his unusual family based on principles that seemed impossible to sustain across decades and centuries, when the temptation of human blood and the ease of traditional vampire feeding made abstinence seem unnecessarily difficult and unnecessarily limiting. Caius's eagerness for execution was predictable and absolute. His enthusiasm for any opportunity to demonstrate Volturi power and to punish violations, making him the strongest advocate for immediate departure to Forks to destroy the Cullens and their illegal creation before they could hide the evidence or before they could flee to territories where finding them might prove difficult even for Dimitri's tracking abilities that had never failed to locate targets once he had established their mental signature and locked onto their supernatural essence that he could follow across continents and across oceans regardless of how far they ran or how carefully they tried to hide from Volturi justice that was inevitable and inescapable once the Volturi decided that violations warranted their personal attention. His argument in the throne room emphasized the precedent that lenient treatment of the Cullens would set, his concern that other covens might interpret mercy or hesitation as weakness and might test the Volturi authority through their own violations if they believed that friendship with Aro or vegetarian lifestyle or accumulated gifts would protect them from consequences that should apply equally to all vampires, regardless of their personal relationships with the ruling authorities or their contributions to vampire culture through their unusual choices and their unusual success at maintaining secrecy, while pursuing lifestyles that most vampires considered impossible or undesirable. Marcus's apathy remained unchanged as always, his presence in the throne room physically complete, but mentally and emotionally absent. His gift of perceiving relationships, showing him the bonds within the Cullen family, and showing him Irina's grief-driven motivations, and showing him the complex web of alliances and enmities that would come into play if the Volturi confronted the Cullens, who had cultivated friendships and respect across vampire civilization through Carlisle's centuries of diplomatic engagement and through their demonstration that alternative vampire lifestyles were possible for those willing to endure the difficulties that came with rejecting human blood. But Marcus's observations and Marcus's insights provided no particular opinion about what action the Volturi should take beyond what Aro and Caius had already decided before asking for his input, that they did not actually want or need, except as formality that maintained the illusion that the three leaders made decisions collectively, rather than Aro making decisions that Caius supported enthusiastically, and that Marcus accepted with complete indifference, born of centuries of depression and resignation to existence that he could not escape and could not end despite wishing for death every moment of every day, since Didym's murder had destroyed everything in him except the physical body and the gift that made him too valuable for the Volturi to release from service, even if such release would have been the mercy that Marcus craved above all else. Their knowledge of immortal children came from personal experience with enforcing the law against creating them. The Volturi, having destroyed dozens or perhaps hundreds of immortal children over their millennia of rule, each case reinforcing their understanding of why the law existed and why exceptions could not be tolerated regardless of how sympathetic individual cases might appear to those who had not witnessed the chaos and the exposure risk that immortal children represented to vampire civilization's security and survival in world, where human populations were growing and where human technology was advancing, and where the margin for error was shrinking with each passing decade as cameras and surveillance and communication networks made hiding supernatural activity increasingly difficult. The children were beautiful and devastating, their eternal youth combined with supernatural strength, making them impossible to discipline or control. Their tantrums capable of destroying buildings and killing humans in numbers that drew attention and created legends, their inability to understand consequences or to delay gratification, making them terrible security risks who would inevitably expose vampire existence to human populations who would recognize that supernatural creatures existed and who would organize resistance once the denial and the rationalization failed to explain away the evidence that accumulated around immortal children whose creators loved them too much to destroy them, but could not control them enough to prevent the disasters that their existence created wherever they went and whatever they touched. The historical precedents were clear and were uniformly tragic. Stories of covens that had created immortal children, believing they could manage the situation and believing their love would be sufficient to teach control and restraint, to creatures whose brains were frozen at developmental stages that preceded impulse control and that preceded understanding of abstract concepts like future consequences or other people's suffering or the importance of maintaining secrecy in world, where exposure meant death for all vampires. Aro remembered a particularly devastating case in ancient Greece where immortal child had destroyed entire village, during tantrum over being denied something she wanted. The creator vampire watching helplessly as his daughter murdered everyone in sight, including the humans he had claimed to protect and to love. The Volturi's arrival requiring destruction of both child and creator, and the careful management of human memory and human records to obscure what had actually happened, and to prevent the incident from becoming permanent evidence of vampire existence that would spread beyond the local region, and that would create broader awareness of immortal predators living among mortal populations. Another case in medieval France had involved Immortal Child, whose creator had been wealthy vampire with resources to hide the child's existence for decades, the arrangement working until the child's tantrums escalated, and until neighbors began asking questions about the ageless child who lived in the castle, and who was never seen in daylight, and around whom servants and visitors disappeared with alarming regularity, that eventually drew attention from authorities who investigated and who discovered enough evidence to suggest witchcraft or demonic possession, or some supernatural explanation for the impossible child and the deaths surrounding her existence. The Volturi had been forced to destroy not just the child and the creator, but several human witnesses and several vampire associates who had known about the child's existence without reporting the violation to Volterra. The thoroughness of their response, designed to send message that protecting or concealing immortal children was itself crime punishable by death, regardless of the protector's relationship to the creator or the protector's motivations in keeping the secret, rather than fulfilling their obligation to report violations that threatened all vampires through their exposure risks. The decision to go to Fawkes personally, rather than summoning the Cullens to Volterra, represented both practical consideration about flight, risk, and theatrical consideration about demonstrating Volturi power in territory, where other covens could witness their authority and their willingness to travel anywhere to enforce laws that protected vampire civilization from exposure and from the chaos that would inevitably follow. If vampires operated without governance or without enforceable standards of behavior that applied to all immortals regardless of their age or their gifts or their personal relationships with the ruling authorities, Aro wanted the confrontation to be public and to be memorable. His understanding that the Cullens had accumulated significant respect and significant allies across the vampire world, making him desire witnesses who would report that the Volturi had acted appropriately and had acted within their authority when they destroyed or recruited the vegetarian coven, whose independence had always represented subtle challenge to Volturi supremacy over all vampire affairs regardless of location or lifestyle choices that individual covens might prefer to pursue in their own territories, away from Volterra's direct oversight. The preparation involved gathering the entire guard, including members who rarely left Volterra, and who served primarily as last line of defense for the castle, and for the 3 leaders whose deaths would create power vacuum that might destroy vampire civilization's governance structure that had maintained order for 2,000 years since the fall of the Romanian Empire, that the Volturi had destroyed through combination of military might and psychological manipulation and strategic patience that had allowed them to outlast and outmaneuver enemies who had seemed invincible until Aro and Caius and Marcus had proven otherwise through their coordinated assault on Romanian power. Jane and Alec were essential for their combat gifts that could incapacitate even powerful opponents through pain illusion and sensory deprivation that made resistance virtually impossible for anyone caught in their respective abilities ranges. Dimitri was necessary for tracking. In case the Cullens fled before the Volturi arrived with their overwhelming force, Felix provided physical strength and combat experience that would be useful if the confrontation turned violent and required traditional combat rather than gift-based warfare. And dozens of other guard members were assembled to create force that would discourage resistance and would demonstrate that challenging Volturi judgment meant facing not just the three leaders but the accumulated might of centuries of strategic recruitment and careful cultivation of the most powerful vampires in existence. The return to Volterra after the Renesmee confrontation carried weight that none of the three leaders could easily dismiss or rationalize away, despite their attempts to frame the retreat as strategic wisdom rather than as defeat or as acknowledgement that their authority was no longer absolute in vampire civilization that had bowed to their will for 2,000 years without serious challenge or without serious threat to their supremacy. The throne room felt different when they assembled after the long journey back across continents. The familiar chairs and the familiar shadows and the familiar routine of their existence somehow altered by what had happened in the snowy forest, where they had faced the Cullens and their witnesses, and had been forced to withdraw without destroying or recruiting anyone, despite having brought their entire military force specifically for that purpose. Aro sat in silence for long moments after their arrival, his mind processing what Alice's vision had shown him, and what the hybrid testimony had revealed, and what the confrontation had demonstrated about the limits of Volturi power in a world where other vampires had stopped fearing them quite as completely as they had feared them for the previous 2 millennia. Caius's rage filled the throne room with tension that made even ancient guard members uncomfortable. His fury at being denied the violence he had anticipated, and his humiliation at retreating before the Cullens and their allies without securing any concessions or any victories beyond the execution of Irina, whose death had served primarily to save face, rather than to accomplish any strategic purpose. He paced and argued and demanded that they plan immediate return to Forks to finish what they had started. His insistence that the Cullens had made them look weak and had encouraged other covens to question Volturi authority, receiving nods from some guard members, but receiving no support from Aro, who understood that another confrontation would only compound their damaged prestige if they attacked without legitimate legal justification, and if they lost lives in battle that Alice's vision had suggested would cost them dearly despite their superior numbers. Marcus watched his fellow leaders with the same apathy that had characterized every moment of his existence since Didym's death, his gift showing him the fraying bonds within the Volturi structure and showing him the fear and the uncertainty that the Renesmee incident had created even among guard members whose loyalty Chelsea maintained through her constant manipulation of their emotional attachments. Aro's obsession with the Cullens intensified after the confrontation, rather than diminishing, despite the logical response being to accept defeat and to move forward with other priorities that might restore their damaged reputation through successful enforcement actions in other territories against other violators who would be easier to destroy than the Cullens had proven to be with their accumulated gifts and their accumulated allies. He spoke constantly about wanting Alice, whose precognition would make the Volturi virtually invincible if they could anticipate every threat and every challenge before those threats materialized into actual dangers requiring response, about wanting Edward, whose telepathy would complement Aro's own gift and would provide redundancy in case Aro was ever incapacitated or destroyed, about wanting Benjamin, whose elemental manipulation represented power that Aro had rarely encountered, and that would add devastating capabilities to the guard's already formidable arsenal of gifts. He wanted the hybrid Renesmee for study and for understanding of what vampire-human reproduction meant for species that had assumed such reproduction was impossible. His collector obsession finding new targets in the Cullen family and their associates, despite or perhaps because of the confrontation that had proven them untouchable through conventional Volturi methods. The discussion of their damaged reputation dominated their private councils for months after the incident. The three leaders and their senior guard members analyzing what the witnesses had seen and what those witnesses would report to their own covens about Volturi power and Volturi authority when they returned to their home territories across the world. The witnesses had seen the Volturi arrive with overwhelming force, had seen them threaten and posture and prepare for battle, and then had seen them retreat without accomplishing any of their stated objectives beyond executing arena for false witness that had been honest mistake rather than malicious accusation warranting death. The optics were terrible from perspective of maintaining fear and maintaining the absolute authority that had characterized Volturi rule since they had destroyed the Romanians. The perception among vampire civilization shifting from viewing the Volturi as invincible enforcers to viewing them as powerful but not omnipotent, and certainly not willing to risk significant casualties, even when laws had potentially been violated, and even when their authority had been directly challenged through Cullen defiance. Their strategies for rebuilding authority focused on demonstrations of force in other territories against other targets who lacked the Cullen's gift and the Cullen's allies, and the Cullen's ability to resist Volturi judgment through combination of military capability and legal ambiguity that had made destroying them politically and tactically costly. They increased enforcement actions across the following years, their trials becoming more frequent and their punishments more severe as they worked to remind vampire civilization that the Renesmee incident represented exception rather than new normal, and that most covens should continue to fear Volturi intervention and should continue to police themselves rather than risking the attention of authorities whose willingness to destroy violators had not diminished despite their strategic retreat from one particular confrontation that had threatened to escalate into war. Neither side could truly win. Exemplary executions of covens that created immortal children, or that operated too visibly, or that drew human attention through careless feeding sent a message that the Volturi remained committed to enforcing fundamental law, even if they had chosen not to destroy the Cullens over hybrid child, whose legal status remained ambiguous. The guard's perspective on the confrontation varied among members based on their individual experiences and their individual understanding of what had happened in the snowy forest and what it meant for their future and for Volturi supremacy that they had dedicated their existences to maintaining through service, that Chelsea's gift made feel like genuine loyalty rather than artificial attachment that could be severed if she chose to release them from bonds she had created. Jane's humiliation at being neutralized by Bella's shield burned in her consciousness every moment of every day after the confrontation. Her power that had always worked on every target, and that had made her the most feared member of the Guard, suddenly rendered useless by a newborn vampire whose gift had emerged specifically to counter mental attacks, and who had stood calmly while Jane tried repeatedly to inflict the pain that usually brought ancient vampires to their knees begging for mercy. The experience of powerlessness and the public nature of her failure in front of witnesses who would spread the story across vampire civilization made Jane's rage and Jane's desire for revenge against the Cullens almost match Caius's own fury at being denied the violence he had craved. Alec's cold calculation about the confrontation focused on tactical analysis rather than emotional response. His assessment that the Cullens had prepared specifically to counter Volturi gifts, suggesting that they had anticipated the confrontation and had gathered allies whose abilities would neutralize the advantages that typically made Volturi victory inevitable in any conflict. His sensory deprivation gift had been countered by Bella's shield protecting multiple targets simultaneously. The other Cullen gifts and the witnesses' gifts had created defensive and offensive capabilities that would have made battle costly, even if the Volturi had ultimately won through superior numbers and through the devastating combination of Jane and Alec working together to incapacitate opponents before Felix and the other physical fighters destroy them. Alec's recommendation in private council was that they avoid confronting the Cullens again unless circumstances changed dramatically in Volturi favor, or unless the Cullens violated laws so clearly that witnesses would support Volturi action, even if that action resulted in significant casualties on both sides. Dimitri's tracking obsession with the Cullens emerged from professional pride and from frustration that his gift's reliability had become tactical liability when Alice's precognition allowed the Cullens to see him coming and to prepare defenses or to flee before he arrived with Volturi forces. His gift had never failed to locate targets and had never been successfully countered by any vampires' abilities across his centuries of service to the Volturi. But Alice's visions meant that tracking the Cullens would always alert them to Volturi approach and would always give them time to prepare or to disappear if they chose to abandon their current location rather than facing judgment. The problem was both tactical and philosophical for Dimitri. His entire identity built around being the tracker who never lost quarry and who made hiding from Volturi justice impossible for anyone anywhere in the world. The Cullen's ability to anticipate his tracking threatening his sense of purpose and his value to the organization that had recruited him specifically for his gift's unique capabilities. Felix's respect for worthy opponents manifested in his assessment of Cullens as fighters who had proven themselves through their defeat of Victoria's newborn army and through their successful defense against Volturi pressure during the confrontation that could have escalated into battle that Felix would have enjoyed despite the risks involved. He appreciated competence and appreciated strength, his centuries of combat experience giving him perspective that younger Guard members lacked about what actually constituted victory and what constituted defeat in conflicts where both sides survived and both sides retained capacity for future confrontation. His view was that the Volturi had avoided costly battle and had preserved their forces for future enforcement actions while learning valuable intelligence about Cullen capabilities and Cullen allies. that would inform any future confrontation if circumstances required renewed attention to the vegetarian coven and their unprecedented situation. Chelsea's constant work maintaining loyalty despite underlying fear created exhaustion that she concealed from the leaders who depended on her gift to keep the guard functional and unified despite the doubts and the questions that the Renesmee incident had raised about Volturi invincibility, and about whether serving the Volturi was a wise long-term decision for vampires with significant gifts who might be valuable enough to other covens that switching allegiances could improve their situations. She strengthened bonds and severed doubts, and created artificial devotion in guard members who might otherwise have considered whether the Cullen's example suggested that independence from Volturi authority was possible for powerful vampires willing to maintain secrecy and willing to defend themselves against Volturi enforcement. Her work was invisible and constant, the manipulation happening continuously in background of guard members' consciousness as she adjusted their feelings and their loyalties to prevent defection, and to prevent the cascade of departures that would follow if even one senior guard member successfully left Volturi service and lived to report that such departure was possible. The wives in their tower experienced the aftermath of the confrontation through limited information and through the tension that radiated through the castle after the leaders returned from their failed expedition to destroy or recruit the Cullens. Sulpicia's contentment in her limited existence remained undisturbed by the broader implications of what had happened, her centuries of captivity masked as honored position making her genuinely believe that she was fortunate to be Aro's mate, and that her life in the tower represented luxury rather than imprisonment that served to keep Aro bound to Volterra and bound to the Volturi through hostage relationship that both sides pretended was genuine marriage. Thenodora's decades of contained frustration intensified after learning details of the confrontation that suggested the Volturi were not as invincible as they had always claimed. Her hope that external forces might eventually free her from Tower and from Caius, warring with her fear that any challenge to Volturi power would result in her death, along with destruction of the entire organization that had held her captive for so long. The daily existence in Volterra continued with the same routines that had characterized the previous centuries, despite the undercurrent of anxiety and uncertainty about whether the Renesmee incident represented temporary setback or represented fundamental shift in power dynamics within vampire civilization that had operated under Volturi supremacy for 2,000 years. The feeding rituals maintained their efficiency, tourists arriving in steady streams to see the medieval city's architecture and history, and becoming meals for the guard in underground chambers, where their deaths went unnoticed and unexplained beyond occasional missing person reports that local authorities attributed to conventional crime or simple disappearance in city that attracted thousands of tourists annually. The throne room proceedings continued with accused vampires brought before the three leaders for judgment, most cases involving minor violations or ambiguous situations, where Volturi interpretation of law determined outcomes that could range from clemency to execution, depending on Aro's assessment of the accused vampire's value, versus their threat to vampire security and vampire secrecy. The underground passages beneath the castle concealed the feeding chambers and the torture rooms and the storage areas where centuries of accumulated wealth sat gathering dust because immortal rulers who who had everything discovered that possessing masterpieces and treasures meant nothing when existence itself felt empty, and when power felt burdensome rather than satisfying. Aro walked these passages sometimes when insomnia or restlessness made him unable to sit still in the throne room or in his chambers, his immortal nature meaning he never truly needed rest, but sometimes desired the illusion of purpose that movement provided when thinking became oppressive, and when the weight of his choices and his crimes pressed too heavily on consciousness that 3,000 years had not managed to dull or to diminish, despite the accumulation of so much blood and so much death across his impossibly long existence. Their wealth accumulated through millennia represented power in human world, where money bought influence and bought silence and bought cooperation from mortal authorities, who never quite understood who they were dealing with, but who accepted bribes and accepted explanations and accepted the presence of the mysterious wealthy family in Volterra, who never seemed to age and who never seemed to leave, but who contributed generously to local economy and local charities in ways that made asking difficult questions seem ungrateful. The art collections filling storage rooms included pieces from civilizations that had risen and fallen during Volturi rule, their aesthetic value genuine, but their possession somehow unsatisfying, when immortality meant that acquiring beautiful objects was simply matter of patience and money, rather than genuine achievement or genuine connection to the beauty that mortal artists had created during their brief lives. The peculiar, immortal problem of infinite time and finite novelty pressed on all three leaders despite their attempts to find meaning or purpose in their continued existence and their continued rule over vampire civilization that seemed to require their governance even when that governance felt mechanical and felt empty, beyond the satisfaction of maintaining power that they had killed to acquire and had killed to maintain across 2,000 years of enforcement and judgment. Aro's gift functioned as curse as much as blessing, every handshake and every touch giving him complete access to another consciousness and another set of memories that became part of his own accumulated experience, making him repository of thousands of lives and thousands of perspectives that should have made him infinitely wise, but instead made him infinitely tired of knowing everything and being surprised by nothing. Once he had touched someone and absorbed their mental history into his own already overcrowded consciousness. The inability to be surprised or deceived or genuinely shocked by anything once he had read someone's mind created loneliness that was unique to Aro among all vampires. His gift isolating him in ways that even other powerful vampires could not fully understand, because they at least retained capacity for genuine uncertainty about other people's thoughts and other people's intentions. He knew everything about everyone he touched, their secrets and their lies and their true feelings and their hidden motivations, all instantly accessible through his gift that had seemed like ultimate power when he was young, vampire discovering his ability, but that felt like curse now after 3,000 years of absorbing other minds and losing any possibility of genuine surprise or genuine mystery in his relationships with others whose thoughts were open books. Once, skin touched skin and truth became unavoidable. Marcos's gift showed him the bonds that kept the Volturi together, the artificial loyalty that Chelsea maintained through constant manipulation, and the fear-based obedience that came from knowing what happened to those who betrayed or disappointed the ancient rulers whose justice was absolute and whose memory was eternal. He saw the rot at the core of their empire, the hollow foundation built on Chelsea's manipulation, rather than on genuine loyalty or genuine respect or genuine belief in Volturi governance as necessary or beneficial for vampire civilization, that it might function just as well without the three ancient rulers who claimed authority, but who ruled through fear rather than through wisdom or through consent of those they governed. The bonds he perceived were fragile despite appearing strong. The entire structure dependent on Chelsea's continued service and continued willingness to maintain the artificial attachments that kept guard members bound to Volterra and bound to service that many would abandon if given genuine choice, free from her gift's influence on their emotions and their loyalties. Caius's paranoia and violence served as the only things that made him feel alive after millennia of existence, where everything had become routine and where nothing truly threatened him anymore, except the boredom and the emptiness that came with having achieved every goal and having destroyed every enemy and having accumulated every form of power that immortal existence could offer. His hatred of werewolves persisted decades after the species had been hunted to near extinction. His occasional reports of werewolf sightings sending him into planning frenzies about hunting expeditions and elimination campaigns that other Volturi members recognized as Caius, searching for purpose rather than responding to genuine threats. The violence was all he had, the only experience that created intensity and created feeling in existence otherwise characterized by apathy and routine that stretched endlessly forward with no possibility of change or growth or genuine novelty that might make immortality feel like gift rather than like sentence to eternal repetition. Their reflections on the Romanians they had deposed created uncomfortable parallels between the empire they had destroyed and the empire they had built in its place. Both structures maintained through fear and violence and the willingness to destroy anyone who challenged their authority or who operated outside their approved parameters. The Romanians had ruled openly and had subjugated humans directly, while the Volturi ruled secretly and enforced laws protecting vampire civilization from exposure. But both systems ultimately rested on military might and on the willingness to kill those who disagreed with their governance or who violated their rules. The philosophical justifications Aro had articulated when they were building their power had given way to simple maintenance of status quo, their enforcement actions serving primarily to preserve their own authority rather than to protect vampire security in ways that might justify the violence and the death toll that accumulated across their 2,000 years of rule. The question of succession haunted their private thoughts, even though none of them would speak about it openly, the reality being that no one could replace them, and no one could defeat them without catastrophic cost that would destroy vampire civilization's governance structure entirely. They were trapped in their own success, too powerful to be overthrown, but too flawed to truly serve the civilization they claimed to protect. Their immortality meaning they would continue indefinitely, unless someone managed to destroy them through combination of overwhelming force and tactical brilliance that would require resources and gifts that currently existed nowhere in the vampire world, except perhaps among the Cullens and their allies, who had demonstrated capacity to resist Volturi power, but who showed no interest in claiming Volturi authority for themselves. And so, the Volturi remain in their castle at Volterra, 3 ancient vampires who built civilization from chaos and discovered that eternal victory tastes like ashes, that absolute power creates absolute emptiness, that living forever means watching everything change while remaining frozen in the moment when ambition became achievement and achievement became prison. The unnecessary evil and cautionary tale. Visionaries who became tyrants, liberators who became oppressors, immortals who learned too late that getting everything you want means discovering it was never enough. Marcus sits wishing for death that will never come, bound to existence by others' needs, and Chelsea's gift, and the cruelty of immortality that offers no escape. Aro collects and rules and knows everything and is surprised by nothing and is more alone than any creature has right to be. Caius rages against enemies mostly extinct and boredom mostly eternal. They are monsters who created order, killers who prevent killing. The beautiful horror at Twilight Center. Their story continues because it cannot end, will never end. The 3 brothers ruling forever in the darkness they created. So rest now, Twilight souls, with the weight of their ancient sorrow. Let the endless ages carry you softly into dreams of better eternities than theirs. May you find the peace that they abandoned when they chose power over everything else that makes existence bearable. Sleep. Good night.